Hi, this is Nick from PrimeLoops.com. Today I'd like to focus on an important effects device, the reverb unit. Although I'll be using the RV7000 to show you these controls, you should know that you can apply this knowledge to any reverb that you use, whether it be a piece of software or hardware. So let's get started. The first thing about reverb and many effects in general is that it can be set up in your chain in a couple of different ways. The first way is to create it as an insert effect. Insert effect means that you're putting the effect directly after the device that you want it to affect. For instance, I have this vocal sample from our Rasta Vocal Samples pack, and if I want to apply some reverb to it as an insert effect, in Reason all I have to do is right click and go to Create and then RV7000, and now it's set up as an insert effect. Now when you set up reverb as an insert effect, the first parameter that you should be looking at is the dry-wet parameter here. Almost every reverb has this parameter, and it's very important because it allows you to balance out the dry or unaffected sound and the wet or effect sound to get the proper mix of elements in your track. For instance, the RV7000 loads up by default all the way wet, so you'll only hear the affected version of the sound if I play this vocal sample back. Conversely, if I drag the knob all the way left to the dry setting, you won't hear any reverb.
Versatile sound!
And of course, if I let this keep playing on a loop and adjusting the dry-wet setting, you'll hear the balance change between the affected version and the dry version.
Versatile sound! Versatile sound! Versatile sound! Versatile sound!
Now the other way to create an effect like this, I'll just go ahead and delete this one for now, is to create it as a send effect. A send effect simply means that you're hooking it up to a mixer. Most mixers have what you call sends and returns, which are specific audio outputs and inputs that interact with effects devices and which allow you to mix one effect on multiple tracks. So for instance, if I right click here on the mixer in Reason and create an RV7000 again, this time as a send effect, you can see up here in the returns list I now have RV7000, and it's associated with return 1, which in itself matches up with send 1 on each of these mixer channels. In this way I can use the same effect, this particular instance of RV7000, to be applied to any of my sounds across all of these mixer channels. Not only that, but using the send knob over here, I can change the balance between the affected sound and the dry sound. The send knob is basically a replacement for the dry-wet knob on the effects unit itself. So when you're using a reverb as a send effect, make sure to keep it all the way wet. So if I play the loop back up here and manipulate the send amount, you'll hear the sound change in a similar fashion to how it did when I was simply tweaking the dry-wet balance back when we created the reverb as an insert effect.
Versatile sound! Versatile sound!
I'm going to delete this and go back to using it as an insert effect. So now let's go through and take a look at the parameters of the reverb unit itself. On this particular reverb, the interface loads up in a very simple way, exposing only a few very important parameters to be tweaked. We've already discussed what the dry-wet knob does. I'll set this to about halfway up. Another parameter that you'll see on just about every reverb is decay. Decay is simply the amount of time that it takes for the reverb to fade out after it's been triggered. So if I set decay time pretty low,
Versatile sound!
you can hear that the decay is pretty short. However, if I increase it quite a bit, it will sound far more cavernous.
Versatile sound!
The RV7000 specifically has a very nice high frequency manipulation section. High frequencies are extremely important in defining the character of a reverb, so it's nice to have a few parameters to tweak like this. Not many reverbs have a high EQ setting, but many of them do have some sort of a damping setting for the high frequencies. High frequency damping is basically a decay parameter for the high frequencies only. So the more you increase high frequency damping, the more quickly the high frequencies of the reverb sound will decay, leaving only the lows and the mids, resulting in a softer, far less bright reverb sound. So if I bring high frequency damping way up, here's what it sounds like.
Versatile sound!
If I bring damping down, you'll have a much brighter sound.
Versatile sound!
The high EQ knob is just what it sounds like. It's an equalizer for the high frequencies of the reverb sound. Whereas high frequency damping simply tells us how long it takes for the reverb to fade out, High EQ tells us how prominent those high frequencies will be in the sound while they're playing out. So if I turn this down, the high frequencies will still decay for a long time, but they'll be much softer.
Versatile sound.
Whereas if I turn high EQ up, you'll have more high frequencies.
Versatile sound.
Now the nice thing about the RV7000 unit is that you can get just about as detailed as you want in tweaking your sound. If you simply click this little Show Remote Programmer button right here, it unfolds a more detailed interface. The next thing we should cover is the concept of an algorithm. An algorithm is simply this unit's way of generating sounds, and there are a variety of different ones available in the RV7000. Each different algorithm in the unit exposes different parameters for you to tweak. For instance, this plate algorithm has a couple of parameters to be tweaked right here. One of those parameters is pre-delay, something that you'll see in a lot of reverb units, and which is very helpful as a special effect. I'll turn the decay down just a little bit for this. And just reset some of these parameters. So what pre-delay does is set up a delay time between when the dry sound plays and when the reverb is actually heard. When I have pre-delay set to 0 milliseconds, which it is by default, you won't have any delay between when the sound occurs and when the reverb occurs.
Versatile sound.
However, if I set pre-delay up a little bit, say up to 142 milliseconds, you'll now hear a little bit of an audible gap between when the dry sound plays and the reverb is triggered.
Versatile sound.
I'll bring that back down and we'll move on. Another commonly found set of controls in a reverb is the EQ section. In the RV7000 it looks like this. You have two bands, it's just a shelf EQ, where you can define what the low frequency is and how loud that particular frequency goes. So for instance, if I set my low frequency up a lot, and then bring the gain down a little bit, you can see that I'm now rolling off most of the low frequencies in the reverb sound. Also take note that this EQ only affects the reverb itself. It doesn't affect the dry sound that's coming into it. And the second band of the EQ is actually fully parametric. That is, you can define its frequency, its gain, as well as its bandwidth or Q. So if I just select a frequency here and bring it up a little bit in gain, you can see that you can actually define a pretty sophisticated EQ curve for the wet part of the sound. And then here's the bandwidth. You can actually expand how many frequencies this band encapsulates. So I'll loop this vocal sample while I mess with some of these EQ settings.
Versatile sound. Versatile sound. Versatile sound. Versatile sound.
Going back up to the algorithm setting here, you'll see that different parameters pop up. If I come down here to the arena setting, a variety of other typical reverb parameters come up, specifically the size and the diffusion parameters. Since a reverb unit is really just trying to recreate a fictional space, the size parameter can be thought of as the size of that space. If I play this back and manipulate the size parameter, you'll definitely get a sense of the room expanding and contracting.
Versatile. Versatile sound. Versatile sound.
The other parameter that pops up a lot in reverbs is diffusion. You can think of diffusion as a smearing effect. The way the reverb sounds without any diffusion is that you can clearly hear all of the different bounces of the reverb off of the walls in this fictional room that we're creating. If you have diffusion turned all the way up, it smears out those bounces to the point where they're not individually audible, but rather they meld together into one smooth reverb sound. I'll first let you hear it with diffusion turned all the way up.
Versatile sound.
You can definitely hear some of the individual bounces, but for the most part, the reverb sound is smoothed out. However, if I turn diffusion way down, you can see that the individual bounces off the walls will be far more audible.
Versatile sound.
That about does it for the typical parameters of a reverb. At the end of the day, it's simply about defining a fictional space and how sound moves around within that space. You can smear out the sound reflections between the walls. You can increase and decrease the size of the room. You can determine how the high frequencies are distributed, which frequencies are actually reverberated, how long the reverb plays out, etc. I'll see you next time for more music production tips and tricks. Stay creative.